With Minnesota's legislative session starting on Monday, progressives will be holding a rally at our capital to advance one of their biggest priorities this year, a constitutional amendment that looks like it's likely to combine radical gender ideology and abortion up until the moment of birth. We'll give you the details on this legislation and this upcoming rally in today's episode. Could this really be on your ballot in November? Hi, I'm Grace Lawrence, the co-host of the Family Beacon podcast, and I'm here with my co-host, Moses Bratchard, and welcome back to Season 4 of the Family Beacon podcast.
Just a quick note for those of you who are listening to rather than watching the podcast, we have a new intro. We love it. We hope you will too, but it doesn't have any words. It's just music for those listening. So for those of you who are listening, we will be back with you in just 15 seconds. Enjoy the music. All right, back into it. I'm so excited to be back in the studio for season four of the podcast. I'm so glad to be back with my co-host, Grace. And we have so much, as always, to talk about. Grace, thank you for capping that up at the beginning. I want to talk about the ERA. Now, I did a little bit of research. People have probably heard the phrase ERA, Equal Rights Amendment. It was first introduced in 1923. Right around the time that women were first allowed to vote. And it's been going and going and going with very few changes. It was never successfully added to the U.S. Constitution, but various states have added it to their constitutions. So this is how the original language reads. And this is as recently as when it was reintroduced in the U.S. Congress in 2014. Section 1, women shall have equal rights in the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, meaning sex, men and women. There are two sexes, right? So that was the original meaning of the ERA. Now, conservatives have often opposed the ERA, and there's a couple reasons why. Notably, we just get to the different roles between men and women. We get to churches that have only men as pastors, and that's the biblical model. We get what courts have decided. They've decided that discrimination on the basis of sex would mean that that taxpayers need to pay for abortion. So that, because otherwise that would be discriminatory. That's not true, but that is what judges have decided. So the ERA has given people a foothold to do that in the states where it has passed. It has never passed in Minnesota, and they've been trying for years, Grace. And now, this year, the amendment keeps getting longer and longer. And as you said, now the amendment looks likely to combine gender and crazy gender ideology that we discuss on the podcast frequently with abortion, which we also discuss on the podcast frequently. Those two things being some of the main areas of contention in our current culture war. And they want to put all this in one amendment, which we can call the Franken Amendment. And I want to read you, this is straight from eramn.org. Okay, this is from the horse's mouth. This is what they're proposing. As far as I know, let me back up a step, because this bill has not actually been introduced yet. There was a version of this bill that passed the Minnesota Senate last year, but it is not this version of the bill. So this would have to be voted on by the U.S. Senate, by the Minnesota Senate again, and as well as by the Minnesota House. And if it was passed by both of those bodies, it would go straight to your ballot in November. The governor doesn't even need to sign it. So this is the text of the new amendment. All persons shall be guaranteed equal rights under the laws of this state. The state shall not discriminate against any person in intent or effect on account of race, color, national origin, ancestry, disability, or sex, including, but not limited to, pregnancy outcomes and reproductive freedom, gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation. So my first critique, Grace, of course, is that this is a run-on sentence. This is extremely long-winded.
Of course.
It is so, there's so much that they're trying to shoehorn into this one sentence. And there's a couple things that I'm just noticing even now. The state cannot intentionally discriminate, but the state cannot do anything that has discriminatory effects. Now, that is hugely broad. Like, I'm not an attorney, okay? And we may need to discuss this with our attorney, Renee Carlson, in future. But it seems to me, Grace, that if the state cannot do anything that will have the effect of discrimination on the basis of race, that might have implications for example, housing and schools. Like, if the state is running the schools and if kids from minority communities are not performing as well, is the state then discriminating against them? Is the state then in violation, or if the individual schools are in violation of the Constitution? So those are questions that come up to me that are occurring to me that don't even have to do with the sex, gender, abortion stuff that is the most concerning aspect here. But I think, Grace, you and I and anyone reading this legislation can see how different this version of the ERA is from the version of the ERA that has now been in currency for almost 100 years. In fact, I would say, would you agree that it's not even fair to call them the same amendment?
Oh, I absolutely agree, Moses. I mean, after talking with our policy team, who has graciously briefed us on this bill, under this bill, it would privilege males who identify as women at the expense of the safety and dignity of women and girls. It would enable males to have a constitutional right to women's and girls' private facilities, their prisons, athletics. All of these things, of course, are not allowed under the current Equal Rights Amendment. But under this new so-called Equal Rights Amendment that is on the ERA Minnesota website, it totally is biased against women. It erases womanhood. And we need to get more into that, Moses.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned at the top of the episode, advocates of this, the organization Gender Justice and others, will be coming together on the first day of the legislative session, Monday, February 12th, to hold a rally for this bill in the Capitol Rotunda. So they're not just introducing this bill as an afterthought. This is key to their legislative agenda for the year. So this is something they're going to be fighting hard to do. So a few weeks ago, I was able to talk to Minnesota Public Radio about this bill. And I want to briefly read what they had to say about it, because it really underlies this is a big deal. And we're not the only ones saying this, to combine these things. So I'm quoting from NPR. After coming up short at the Capitol for more than a decade, backers of a Minnesota Equal Rights Amendment view 2024 as their moment. Ahead of the 2024 legislative session, they're tweaking a proposed addition to Minnesota's Constitution to address new concerns around equality. That has meant explicitly spelling out rights to pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes. The authoring groups have not formally agreed to the final draft. The result could yield the most expansive equal rights policy, so-called, in the country. Advocates say the change is critical in this political moment, while opponents say it's a Trojan horse that could come with unintended consequences, et cetera, et cetera. Moses Bratchard, the intelligent and charismatic spokesperson from Minnesota Family Council, said the measure goes too far. He said his organization would mobilize a campaign to block the amendment if lawmakers approve it. We think a large majority, in fact, believe that Minnesota's current protections for equal rights are sufficient, and they don't want to see a Trojan horse bringing taxpayer-funded abortion and gender reassignment surgery into the state budget. Now, I may have edited that a bit, Grace.
I was going to say, intelligent and charismatic? What a compliment you received.
Well, as I sometimes tell my kids, let another's lips praise you and not your own. So I should have probably not added that, but I did. It's a joke. We try to be lighthearted about these things because this is coming down the pike. So I can absolutely guarantee you folks that we will be talking more about the ERA, but as we come into session next week, the progressives have signaled that this is one of their top legislative priorities. This is something that Minnesota Public Radio has said, we're not saying this, They are saying this would be the most expansive so-called equal rights policy in the country. Absolutely unprecedented. And because they're calling it the Equal Rights Amendment, because that's what they're calling it. They're calling it something that's familiar to people, that people are unfortunately more likely to support than if they called it the Gender and Abortion Smorgasbord Franken Amendment.
Yeah,
maybe
Moses,
I can make that. Maybe we can make that catch on.
You're totally right. That is a Trojan horse. I really like your wording there.
And I wanted to, before we talk about the other bills that we can expect this section, Grace, and you're going to bring us more information on that, I want to extend our condolences to our friends at Center of the American Experiment, Upper Midwest Law Center, and Take Charge Minnesota. They all work out of the same office building, I think in Edina. I've been there once, but I can't swear whether it's Edina or one of the other suburbs there. And they had an arson attack at their office.
Oh, wow.
And this is just so scary. We saw an arson attack at our sister organization, Wisconsin Family Council.
Mm-hmm.
We saw vandalism and graffiti at Minnesota Citizens Concern for Life. And now these other conservative pro-family groups
and
are
local
being
pregnancy
targeted.
Resource centers too. I mean, the list goes on
Absolutely.
and on.
That's right. Yes. So there are elements within the Progressive Coalition who think that it's acceptable to attack their opponents with fire. So I'm going to read briefly from John Hinderaker at American Experiment. This is the email update he sent out today. At 2 a.m. on Sunday, January 28th, someone broke into our office building and set it on fire. 2 separate fires were created, clearly targeting us and the 2 other conservative groups who have offices inside the building. The fires took out entire portions of the building on the 1st and 3rd floors. Thankfully, the fire department responded quickly and successfully put out the fires before the flames spread to the entire building. No one was hurt, thank God. But we incurred significant damage, and our building has been shut down entirely for the foreseeable future. There's pictures that I've seen. It looks absolutely horrific. Definitely an even bigger arson attack than what we saw at Wisconsin Family Council last year. Yeah, it's horrifying. It's horrifying.
Hadn't even heard of this, Moses.
In
this
Minnesota.
Is crazy. Yeah.
I know. Yeah, it's insane. So we want to extend our condolences and our prayers to our friends and allies at those organizations. We want to help and support them as they now move into temporary office space, and of course we want to help them bring the perpetrator to justice. They're going to be offering a reward. When that information comes out, we'll make sure to share it so that anyone who has any information about who may have caused this can take action, and we can bring these people to justice. And I just want to say, at Minnesota Family Council, we're doing everything to make sure our office is safe, and that we can continue our work with the Lord's help, so that we can continue our work without that type of horrific attack. Wow. So and it's just heavy. It's just heavy to talk about that. It really brings it home that people might be targeted, that we might be targeted just for the work that we do and for fighting for the values of millions of Minnesotans. It's kind of crazy, but that's the political moment that we're in right now. And speaking of that, Grace, you have a list of legislation that we expect to come up this session that you have come up with after discussions with our public policy team. So these are some of the biggest, as far as I know, the biggest threats that we can expect to see in the 2024 legislative session, which starts next week.
That's right, Moses. And thank you so much for breaking down the so-called Equal Rights Amendment already. I'm not going to cover that since we already discussed it briefly. But again, you guys can expect that we will be talking about this on the podcast again. We'll likely have Renee Carlson on or Rebecca Delahunt on to discuss that, who are in-house experts on this. But I did want to highlight some other things that we can expect progressives to push this legislative session. So the first thing I want to bring to your attention is the so-called Gender-Affirming Rights Act. Now, if you want to look up this bill number, I'm gonna give you the bill numbers. It's House File 2280 and it's Senate File 2236. Now, what does this so-called Gender-Affirming Rights Act do that we expect progressives to push? Well, by stating that, quote, every individual has the right to determine their own gender and related gender-affirming health care, this policy exposes children to the gender, medical, industrial complex by claiming that those children regardless of their age, have the right to make their own healthcare decisions without parental or guardian input. Mic drop. Moses. Wow, that's a lot right there. That is very, very crazy. Regardless of age, any child, no matter how old they are, under this bill, if passed, would have the right to make healthcare decisions without any input from their parent or guardian. That we can expect progressives to be pushing this. And,
It's absolutely insane.
It is absolutely insane.
We know that, like, if you're 15, 16, you can't go on a field trip or get a tattoo without parental permission.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a tattoo is kind of comparable. Hopefully the field trip won't have lifelong consequences, right? But a tattoo, you have that for life. So you cannot get one without parental permission if you're under 18. So why, Grace, why do you think progressives are saying, oh, no, gender care, that's completely different than a tattoo? It's like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's all in line with what we saw them pushing last session, similar to the kidnapping bill, which we talked about extensively on here and on social media, which enabled a court of the state to take custody of children if their parents disagree with gender ideology. I mean, we're seeing a push by the government, by our government, by the progressive government to strip away parental rights and to promote gender ideology in the youngest around us. And I think ultimately that's what it boils down to. Would you agree, Moses?
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely criminal. And like, let's step back and take a moment to understand, like, our opponents on this issue. They think that if a child is experiencing distress because and if a child is experiencing distress, that's really bad, okay? That needs to be dealt with. Parents, therapists, faith leaders need to come alongside that child. We're talking about serious cases oftentimes, rather than just, following a trend. We're talking often about kids who are dealing with other mental health issues that are maybe feeding into this. Mm-hmm. And then we have this loud community, as we've talked about before, of online influencers and peers perhaps at school who say, becoming transgender, putting aside your birth sex, is something that will help you become more comfortable in your body, become more comfortable with your peers, and even just find a sexuality that works for you, to use that type of language. But actually, that's false. That's not the cure to anything. And so we see these people, and we see them coming from a place of compassion and saying, and I believe that they do care, that they think they're doing the right thing. But that doesn't absolve them of responsibility when what they're advocating is the sterilization of children before their frontal temporal cortex is fully even developed enough to make that type of life-changing decision, even assuming we let anyone make that type of life-changing decision and alter their body in that horrific way. And I say horrific because surgery can take away your genitalia and can give you some simulacrum of the genitalia of the opposite sex. But the sad truth is that it doesn't work very well. And people are left with more or less non-functional
mutilated bodies.
Mutilated bodies. That's exactly what I'm going for. I'm trying to dance around that, but that's what we need to say. So
yeah, let
me get off my soapbox for a second. I just wanted to say, like, we see where people are coming from, but we don't go with them to this place that they're going to. That is not the solution. Never.
And it is heartbreaking that the attack on parental rights is continuing in our state. So just stay up to date with our podcast. Make sure you turn on post notifications because we'll keep you informed on this bill and the other bills I'm about to tell you about. So the next one I want to discuss with you is comprehensive sex education. Now, again, if you want to look up these bill numbers, that's HF 174 and Senate File 662. Now, let's break it down. This bill, if passed, would require the Minnesota Commissioner of Education to create a model policy of comprehensive sex education for school districts in the state and for school districts and charter schools to implement a comprehensive sex education program for students starting as young as elementary school. Now, this program can be taught by individuals from, quote, community organizations who are not licensed teachers. So you guys, this is just a loophole for people such as employees of Planned Parenthood, who is the largest provider of comprehensive sex ed in the state of Minnesota. It basically enables those employees to inform your children as young as elementary age on concepts such as consent, relationships, and quote unquote diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. And get this, you guys, it gets worse. Also role play. That's what this legislation would allow if enacted. And again, we are tracking this, and we believe progressives are going to try to push this in this session. Moses, you're a parent. What are your thoughts on this?
I'll try to keep my thoughts PG rated. Yeah, this is insane. The sad part is, and you touched on this, schools are already doing this all over the state, and it's just not mandated, right? And I had a friend actually who went to public schools. Should I say what district? Yeah, probably not going to get anyone in trouble. Burnsville Public Schools. So this is someone who is pushing 30. And when he went through sex ed in high school in Burnsville Public Schools, the emphasis was on abstinence, and the emphasis was on risk avoidance. And that's the kind of the alternative to comprehensive sex ed that's used in secular schools is the idea of sexual risk avoidance, or SRA. I'm not saying that's necessarily better, and it still has probably a lot of problematic stuff, in fact. But the idea is teenagers don't need to hear about gender identity stuff. They need to know how to avoid the risks associated with sexual activity, principally by not having sex. That is the surefire way to not get pregnant or get an STD, right? It actually works 100% of the time. And so that's what he experienced. But now his younger sisters are in the same school district in Burnsville schools. And their mom is pulling them out of these health classes because the content has changed so much that it is absolutely, just in the last 6 to 10 years, the content has become absolutely, it's sexualized. I don't have details about this curriculum, but I don't even know if it is quote unquote comprehensive sex ed down in this particular school district. But that's what we're talking about. And another thing, you talked about community organizations, and I'm sorry if you said this and I missed it, but did you say that we know that Planned Parenthood is the largest group?
I did.
Providing these? Thank you.
Awful.
I'm sorry I missed that.
No,
it's
you're
worth
good.
repeating. Planned Parenthood, a group which makes its money off of ripping children out of their mother's wombs, is in your schools teaching your kids about sex. Who's okay with that?
I hope none of you. Yeah. It's
Exactly.
truly awful. Again, we're going to keep you informed on this. So turn on post notifications, and we will update you as we see movement on this. But also, I did want to talk to you guys about one more bill. Now, this bill has already been pushed, and this bill is actually a physician-assisted suicide bill. And this is HF 1930 or Senate File 1813. And we already saw this being pushed by progressives before session even began. So if you've been following our communication stream anywhere on any of our platforms, you have seen that in an attempt to get ahead before session even began, on Thursday, January 25th, a progressive committee met up and passed this assisted suicide legislation, passed it through this committee. Now, it has to hit another committee and maybe even more, but at least one more committee before it would even be voted on by the whole House. But I want to inform you guys on what exactly this means. What exactly is in this bill? Well, if this bill was enacted, it would permit doctors to prescribe a lethal drug overdose when an adult patient has received a diagnosis of a 6-month terminal illness. Now, this language does not require a mental illness evaluation from a licensed health professional. It does not require any notification for family of the adult patient that is desiring to undergo physician-assisted suicide. So this means their family is not required to be notified. They can take this pill and no one is told. It also does not require a witness to this event. So this patient can take this pill and pass away, and no witness is required. Now, I hope that you can see how slippery of a slope that could be. Not only that, but in this language, there are no safeguards against elder abuse or abuse of patients with disabilities. Now, because healthcare is expensive and death is expensive, we need to ask ourselves, at what time does the, quote, right to die, as the opposition is saying over here, at what point does the right to die become the duty to die? Now, you can say, well, Grace, you're just making a slippery slope argument. Actually, this is a cliff that we are seeing in other countries, in other states like Oregon. We're seeing what happens when this kind of legislation is enacted, and easily, swiftly, very fastly, things like elder abuse, discrimination against patients with disabilities, these things come up. And in certain countries, this is legal for children already. Right now, this bill, as it stands, is for adults. But think how swiftly Minnesota could enact something like this to be legal for children if they're going to go so far with this. Moses would love to hear your thoughts.
It's a lot easier to amend a bill that exists to include children, people with disabilities, or as they've recently done in Canada or are about to do, I think in March actually, allow people to receive the fatal medication just for displaying signs of a psychiatric ailment. For example, depression, severe depression, right? Like, which is insane to me. Those diseases are not fatal. You are telling depressed people, well, so yeah, we can talk about treatment, we can talk about therapy, or we can actually just talk about you ending your life. I don't think that's the message that we want to send to people who are depressed. In fact, I would send them to the suicide prevention hotline if they are experiencing suicidal ideation, or to a trustworthy therapist who actually cares for their life and believes that they can make progress fighting depression, which is a disease, but not a terminal one. And so this is frightening, Grace. As you know, I was at this hearing. I was hearing things from both sides.
Yeah.
There were some absolute whoppers. I some of the most ridiculous things I don't even want to go into because it would probably derail us a little bit. But it is just so clear to me that people are not considering the harms that this will provide. You mentioned no notification of family members. The requirement that a physician or a pharmacist, if they have conscious objections to this, they have to refer someone to someone who will prescribe the fatal medication and then fill that prescription for the fatal medication. There's also no control over that fatal medication. Oh, there's the person just gets it, or right? Like there's no guarantee that they are giving it to themselves. Right. And so you talked about elder abuse. One of those scenarios is that, God forbid, a caregiver who is sick of being a caregiver could administer that fatal medication, and it would then look as if the person had done it themselves. That is what we're talking about. That does occasionally happen, but now we're giving people a legal avenue to do that, and with almost perfect cover. So it's extremely frightening.
It really is.
This is something I wanted to say one more thing, which is we really need to keep this from moving in the Minnesota Senate and to keep it moving further in the Minnesota House. So watch your emails and social media. We will alert you if there are going to be more hearings. I want to thank the people who stood up and testified against this. We heard from relatives of people who died, from people who died or were dying. We heard from doctors and ethicists. We heard from attorneys. We heard from veterans. We heard from members. We heard from someone who works for the NAACP. We heard from, there were some other ones that I'm forgetting. There was just, the disability rights activists. There are so many people standing up and saying, this is scary. This is hurting our communities. This is not... Minnesota is a state with some of the best healthcare in the country, and we're talking about killing people. People are just, their minds are boggled that this is being discussed. As you said, though, life is expensive, death is cheap. Some people think this is about saving the state money. And I think that is just one of the most chilling aspects of this whole thing.
It really is. Moses, you brought up some great points, and I'm so glad you were able to actually be there when this was happening. I was able to watch it live from my computer screen. And one question I had, and you kind of tapped into this a little bit just talking about mental health, but one question I have is, why do progressives rightly grieve over suicidal teens and yet wrongly celebrate assisted suicide for the terminally ill? Why is it they do that? Another thought I had after watching all this and hearing all the testimonies is that we should not be putting Minnesota's medical professionals in a position where they become agents of death, because of course that goes against their duty to help and not harm.
Absolutely.
Assisted suicide is ultimately just the opposite of compassion because it abandons the patient. It doesn't offer them more care. It abandons them and says, there's nothing more that we are going to do for you. And I think ultimately, you guys watching, and Moses and I, and everyone else at Minnesota Family Council need to speak the truth that when we're dependent on others, it doesn't make us less valuable or our lives less worth living. And I think when we speak up and we speak that message, people are given hope, and we see the culture change. So I would encourage you to speak up about this and join us in promoting policy that improves end-of-life services such as palliative care rather than pushing for murder of the most vulnerable in our society. Woo, that was a lot.
Thank you, Grace.
Yep.
Yes.
That was a lot that we just covered,
That's
you
heavy.
guys. It's really heavy. There's a lot of stuff. Again, we will keep you informed. So it's important for you to share this podcast with your friends and family here in Minnesota so that they can also be informed on this. Before we close out our episode, Moses, I did want to talk about our annual dinner, our 2024 annual dinner, and our theme for that. Would you be willing to share with our audience what our theme is and what our heart is behind it?
Absolutely. So I want to tell you right up front, go to mfc.org/dinner 2024. You can get all the details, and you can even right now pre-register so that you'll be the first to hear when tickets become available. So Grace, we did that last year. We allowed people to pre-register, and I don't think you've heard this from me yet, so I will tell you, we have 4 times as many people pre-registering this year as we had last year.
That's awesome.
Okay? Like,
it's because our theme is so good. Our speaker is
our
so
theme
good.
is so good. And I haven't even told you. So our theme this year, rulers rage, God laughs. It's taken right from Psalm 2, right from the Bible. Mic drop. And our keynote speaker and special guest is Seth Dillon, the CEO and co-founder of the Babylon Bee. And we are so excited. And, you know, Grace and I, like you and I have talked about this, and we've talked about some really heavy stuff today. So much of what we do is heavy. And Seth Dillon and the Babylon Bee, they do an amazing job of taking things that are truly sad, bad, mad, and crazy, and making them into things that we can laugh at, because when you laugh at something, it like loses its power over you, right? And Seth Dillon himself has said, you know, part of the reason we're in this crazy time is because we have not been allowed to laugh at laughable ideas. We have not allowed to hold them in derision. And that is what we should be doing. And why should we be doing that? Because we see God doing that. God laughs at the designs of the wicked and the rage of the rulers. And so that's where our theme comes from. And I am so excited. I know you are too, Grace. Yes. April 26th at the Doubletree by Hilton in Bloomington. You can register now to join us. We even have, or we can't register, can't buy tickets quite yet, but you can pre-register, and tickets will be available soon. And we'll have that link in the show notes. I also want to say that for the first time ever, we have special discounts for first-time guests. So if you've never joined our annual dinner, you got to reach out right now, because we have a limited number of heavily discounted tickets available for those who have never been to one of our events and would really like to check it out. So I'm really excited about that. Grace, what are you most excited about with this event?
You know, I think I'm so excited just to instill hope in in everyone that attends this event. I mean, yeah,
Amen.
there's a lot of bad stuff swirling, but ultimately at the end of the day, we as Christians are rejoicing because we know how the story ends. We don't know every little tidbit. We don't know how every chapter is going to go. For a time, it may look like the wicked are winning in our legislature, in our culture, but that is not true. And that is the goal of our event, to bring you guys hope and to give you guys ways to act against wickedness and to stand up for righteousness. So I actually wanted to share a verse.
Amen.
Thank you. I actually wanted to
Sorry.
share a verse with you guys. That is our theme verse for this event. Rulers rage, God laughs is a distillation of Psalm 2, like Moses mentioned. So I want to read that for you guys as we close. And then I just want to share a few more thoughts on our theme. So let's read it. It says, "Why do the nations rage, and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in heaven laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree the Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel." And then it goes on to say, blessed are all who take refuge in him. And wow, that is just such an encouraging and bold verse for us. And this ruler's rage, God laughs, restates the biblical promise found in Psalm 2 here, that in the long run, evil loses because God wins. And while we can see that some of Minnesota's rulers are pushing against God's design by pushing wicked legislation like assisted suicide and other legislation that promotes the murder of children and the rupture of the family, you and I can rejoice because we know that their striving is ultimately in vain. Evil is so powerless before God that he actually laughs at it. The Lord is scoffing at his enemies, and he is promising to lead their ways to destruction. And that's why we at Minnesota Family Council are not deterred at all by how ungodly rulers are conspiring. So I urge you again to join us at our annual dinner. Again, you can pre-register now at mfc.org/Moses, what's the tagline? /annual dinner?
mfc.org/dinner 2024.
So I urge you to join us because it is going to be so hopeful, so inspiring. You're going to be surrounded by so many like-minded Minnesotans, and you're also going to be surrounded by MFC staff. So come meet us there.
And we're pretty cool.
We are pretty cool if we do say so ourselves. Moses, do you have anything else to say before we close out the episode?
I do have one thing, and that is that I'm just so excited to be back with you, Grace, and with our listeners and viewers, and with Christine behind the camera, who is amazing, for this 4th season of The Family Beacon. I could be wrong, but I think I saw yesterday we had 99 episodes on Apple Podcasts. So it might be that this is also our 100th episode. I'm not certain about that math. But at any rate, we have been doing this now this is going into our 4th year. And we are so excited to keep doing this, to keep informing you, making sure that as Minnesotans with faith, we are able to get the facts so that we can stand for truth. I'm Moses Bradford with Grace Lawrence. Thank you so much for watching or listening to the Family Beacon podcast from Minnesota Family Council. Catch you next week.